When Dylan and Claire Mitchell first set foot in the sprawling desert estate, they were enchanted. The house, nestled against the backdrop of rugged California mountains, had once belonged to Chad McQueen, son of the legendary Steve McQueen. Though the actor and racer had passed away in 2024, his presence in Hollywood history remained indelible. The Mitchells hadn't known much about Chad beyond his lineage and a handful of movies. What attracted them to the house was its isolation, its sweeping views, and the aura of quiet grandeur it exuded. But after moving in, they quickly realized that someone had never truly left. It started with the sound of an engine revving in the dead of night. Dylan, who had grown up around cars, recognized the deep, guttural roar of an old muscle car. The first time he heard it, he assumed it was coming from the road behind their property. But when he looked outside, the long, moonlit driveway was empty. Then came the footsteps. Claire would hear them pacing the upstairs hallway when she was home alone, measured, deliberate. She swore she could feel a presence lingering just out of sight. One evening, as she folded laundry in their bedroom, she caught movement in the mirror. A figure just for a second in the reflection behind her. She spun around, nothing. But the strongest sign came 2 weeks later, when they found the garage door open. Dylan knew for certain he had locked it the night before. But there it was, wide open. A faint smell of motor oil and burning rubber hanging in the air. On the workbench, an old spark plug lay beside a dusty wrench, neither of which belonged to them. By now, they had started digging into the house's history. They learned that Chad McQueen had spent countless hours in that very garage, tuning up vintage motorcycles and muscle cars, carrying on his father's passion. His last project, a 1968 Mustang Fastback, had been unfinished when he died. The pieces started falling into place. The sounds, the footsteps, the scent of oil. Claire was the first to suggest what neither of them wanted to say aloud. "What if it's him?" she whispered one night. "What if he never left?" Dylan didn't believe in ghosts, but something was there, and it didn't feel menacing, just restless. Instead of fighting it, they decided to embrace it. Dylan cleared a section of the garage, dedicating it to Chad's memory. He framed old photos of him at the racetrack, restoring cars, smiling with his father. Claire found a model of the Mustang he had been working on and placed it on a shelf. And then, everything stopped. The sounds, the footsteps, the eerie reflections, they all faded. The Mitchells still live in the house, and though they rarely speak about those first weeks, they believe Chad McQueen had simply been looking for recognition, for someone to remember him not as Steve McQueen's son, but as the man he was. Maybe now he could finally rest. The wind rolled in slow and heavy that evening, carrying with it the scent of desert sage and the fading warmth of the sun-baked earth. Claire stood at the kitchen window, her hands wrapped around a ceramic mug, watching as twilight settled over the property. The sky stretched vast and endless, the last embers of daylight flickering against the jagged silhouette of the mountains. The house had been quiet for weeks now, no phantom footsteps, no engines growling in the night, but a part of her still felt as though something unseen lingered just beneath the surface. She exhaled, shaking off the thought, and turned toward the open-concept living room where Dylan sat hunched over his laptop. His fingers tapped idly against the keyboard, but his eyes were distant, unfocused. She knew he had been thinking about it, too. "You ever get the feeling," she began, her voice careful, measured. Dylan didn't look up. "That he's still here?" Claire hesitated. "Not in a bad way." A pause. Then he nodded, rubbing at his jaw. "Yeah." There was no denying it, the way the house felt, as if it held its breath when they spoke of Chad McQueen. The way the desert air turned thick with something almost tangible in certain corners of the property. The feeling in the garage, where Dylan had placed the framed photographs, was different now. No longer uneasy, no longer restless. And yet, one night, about a week after they set up the small tribute, Dylan had woken to the sensation of movement in the bed beside him. Not Claire shifting in her sleep, but something else, a pressure against the mattress, like the weight of a body sitting just at the edge. He had lain there in the dark, heart pounding, every muscle rigid as he listened. Nothing, no sounds, no footsteps, but the feeling remained, a cold stillness pressing down on his chest. Then, just as quickly as it had come, it was gone. He never told Claire. Not because he didn't believe it had happened, but because he wasn't sure he wanted to know what it meant. Now, as she watched him from across the room, she saw the shadow of something unspoken in his expression. "Dylan." He blinked, snapping out of his daze, and shook his head as if clearing it. "Sorry. Just thinking." But he didn't say what he was thinking. Outside, the wind shifted. The branches of the Joshua trees creaked in protest, their spindly arms twisting against the dusky sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote yipped a lonely, wavering cry that faded into the deepening night. Claire set her mug down, the sound of ceramic meeting marble too loud in the hush of the house. The space felt too large all of a sudden, as if the walls had drawn back just slightly, allowing something unseen to slip between them. "I think we should do more," she said suddenly. Dylan frowned. More what? More for him. He didn't have to ask who she meant. Instead, he studied her for a long moment, weighing her words, considering the unspoken feeling they both had been trying to ignore. "What are you thinking?" he asked finally. Claire glanced toward the hallway, the long corridor that led to the garage, to the space that had once been Chad's sanctuary. "I don't know," she admitted, "but it feels like something's still unfinished." Dylan exhaled through his nose, pushing back from his chair. He scrubbed a hand over his face, then ran his fingers through his hair. "All right," he said, standing. "Let's find out what it is." And with that, they turned toward the hallway, toward the lingering shadow of something unresolved, toward the place where the past had not yet let go. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The hallway stretched before them, long and dim, lined with framed photographs left behind by the previous owner. Most were shots of cars sleek, vintage machines gleaming under showroom lights or kicking up dust on racetracks. Others were of Chad himself, frozen in time. Arms crossed, leaning against the hood of a Mustang, eyes shaded by aviator sunglasses. In the stillness of the house, the images felt almost watchful. Claire trailed her fingers along the wall as they walked, feeling the cool press of the frames beneath her touch. The air here was different, heavier. It carried a faint metallic tang, the scent of old gasoline and engine grease, as though the garage itself was breathing. Dylan reached the door first. He hesitated, hand hovering just above the knob. He wasn't sure why he had been in there dozens of times since they moved in. It was just a garage. But something about opening it now, after what Claire had said, felt different. Finally, he turned the handle and pushed. The heavy door groaned on its hinges, revealing the cavernous space beyond. The garage was larger than most, built to house more than just a single car. Shelves lined the walls, cluttered with tools, spare parts, and dusty cans of motor oil. In the far corner sat Dylan's own car, a black Challenger, its polished surface reflecting the dim overhead light. But his eyes weren't drawn to the car. They were drawn to the workbench. Claire must have seen it too, because she let out a slow breath beside him. The framed photos they had set up, the ones meant to honor Chad's memory, had moved. Before, they had been arranged neatly along the far wall, standing upright in careful rows. Now they were scattered. Some had toppled forward, others faced away, as if unseen hands had shifted them in the night. The model Mustang Claire had placed on the shelf was no longer there. Dylan stepped forward, heart hammering against his ribs. He reached out and turned one of the frames upright again. It was a black and white image of Chad at a racetrack, standing beside a car with the number 68 painted on its side. "You didn't move these?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Claire shook her head. "No." He crouched, scanning the floor, and then he saw it, the missing model car. It lay a few feet away, face down on the concrete, as if it had been knocked over. Dylan picked it up carefully. The moment his fingers closed around the tiny Mustang, something changed. A chill prickled across the back of his neck. The air grew thick, charged, like the moments before a summer storm. And then so faintly he might have imagined it, he heard the whisper of an engine turning over. Not loud, not aggressive, just the soft, distant purr of a car idling somewhere beyond sight. Claire sucked in a breath. She had heard it too. Dylan turned the model car over in his hands. His thumb brushed against the undercarriage, and that's when he noticed something odd. A tiny, faint scratch on the metal base. 3 lines, uneven but deliberate. A number, 68. The same number from the photograph. Dylan looked at Claire, his grip tightening around the model car. "He's trying to tell us something," she whispered. Dylan swallowed. He didn't believe in ghosts. Not really. But standing there, in that dimly lit garage, holding a car that had moved on its own, staring at a number that kept appearing over and over again, he wasn't so sure anymore. The hum of the phantom engine faded, leaving behind only silence. Then, somewhere in the house, a door creaked open. Not slammed, not burst, just opened. Slowly, deliberately. Claire's hand found Dylan's arm, her fingers cold against his skin. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. They just listened. The sound lingered, stretching through the silence like a breath held too long. The Mitchells stood frozen in the garage, the open door to the house yawning behind them like the mouth of something waiting. Claire's grip on Dylan's arm tightened, her nails pressing into his skin, but neither of them moved. Somewhere down the hall, past the living room, past the kitchen, a door had creaked open. Not a gust of wind, not a faulty hinge. A sound with weight, with purpose. Dylan swallowed hard. His eyes darted toward the open door of the garage, where the dim glow of the hallway light barely reached, spilling onto the concrete floor like a dull spotlight. Claire's breath came shallow and quick beside him. "Which door was that?" she whispered, though she already knew. Dylan exhaled through his nose. The study. Neither of them had been in there for days. A hesitation passed between them, the kind that braced itself before something inevitable. Then, as if pulled by an unseen tether, Dylan stepped forward. Claire didn't let go of his arm, moving with him, their shadows stretching long against the garage walls as they crossed back into the house. The air changed as soon as they stepped inside. Warmer yet heavier. Not oppressive, but thick-charged, as if something had just passed through, leaving an echo of itself behind. The hallway stretched ahead of them, the house unervingly quiet. Dylan's pulse drummed against his throat as they moved toward the study. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was something deeper, something instinctual. A sense that they were crossing into a space that wasn't entirely their own anymore. The study door stood ajar, just as they knew it would be. A sliver of darkness lay beyond, unlit and waiting. Dylan reached for the light switch. The bulb flickered to life, casting long, slanted shadows over the room. Everything looked normal. The large wooden desk, the leather armchair, the neatly arranged bookshelves. But the air still felt different, stirred, like water settling after something had moved through it. And then Claire saw it. The chair. It had been turned. When they had last been in here, it had been tucked neatly beneath the desk. Now it was angled slightly, facing the doorway, as if someone had been sitting there, watching, waiting, then left when they arrived. Claire's stomach clenched. "Dylan." He followed her gaze. His jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. Instead, he stepped forward, slow and deliberate, his hand skimming the edge of the desk. His fingertips brushed against something rough. He frowned, looking down. A stack of old papers sat there, yellowed at the edges, undisturbed except for the one on top. One that hadn't been there before. Dylan picked it up. It was a page torn from a notebook, the handwriting bold and uneven, as if it had been scrawled in haste. "Find it." That was all it said. 2 words, nothing more. Claire's breath hitched. "Find what?" Dylan turned the page over, but the back was blank. He exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face, grounding himself, trying to think. Then his eyes flicked back to the note. The handwriting. It wasn't his. It wasn't Claire's. It wasn't even the same careful, measured script that Chad McQueen had used in the letters and documents they had found while researching the house's history. This was something else. A message left for them. Dylan stared at the note, mind racing. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't a threat. It was a directive. A guide. A request. Somewhere in this house, in this place, something had been left behind. Unfinished. Waiting. And now it wanted to be found. Dylan turned the note over again, as if expecting more to appear, but the page remained stubbornly blank. Claire shifted beside him, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. The silence between them stretched, heavy with the unspoken understanding that whatever was happening, whoever was here, would not stop until they followed the message. "Find it," she murmured, voice barely above a whisper. "But what is it?" Dylan's gaze lifted to the study, scanning the bookshelves, the desk, the chair that had moved on its own. His mind worked through the pieces: Chad McQueen, the cars, the number 68 scratched into the model Mustang. Something about that number. And then, it hit him. "The Mustang," he said suddenly. His real Mustang. Claire frowned. "The one he was working on before he died?" Dylan nodded, already moving toward the door. "I need to check something." Claire followed as he strode back toward the garage, his steps quick and purposeful now. The moment they crossed the threshold, the air turned thick again, charged with the same strange energy that had filled the house before. Dylan went straight to the workbench, setting the note down beside the model car. Chad's Mustang was a 68 fastback, he said, more to himself than to Claire. The same number in the picture, the same number scratched into this model. But his actual car, where did it go after he died? Claire's brow furrowed. "I don't know. Wouldn't his family have kept it?" "Maybe," Dylan muttered. "But what if they didn't?" He pulled out his phone, fingers flying over the screen as he searched. Articles, old interviews, anything that might give him a clue. Then he found it. A news snippet from months ago. Unfinished Mustang fastback, once owned by late actor Chad McQueen, sold at auction after estate settlement. Buyer remains anonymous. Claire leaned over his shoulder, reading the words along with him. "Anonymous?" she whispered. "What if?" A bang sounded from outside. Both of them jumped, eyes snapping toward the garage door. The wind howled through the desert, rattling the wooden frame, but the noise hadn't been from the wind. It had come from the driveway. Dylan moved first, pushing open the side door. The night air rushed in, cold and biting, the scent of sage and dust thick on the breeze. The sky above was vast, littered with stars, but his attention locked onto the driveway, onto what wasn't there. No cars, no movement, just the faintest impression of tire tracks in the dirt. Fresh ones. He swallowed hard. "Claire." She stood behind him, her breath uneven. "Do you smell that?" she whispered. Dylan inhaled and his stomach turned. Motor oil, burnt rubber, gasoline, the distinct scent of a car that had been here just moments ago. He turned back toward the garage, toward the workbench, toward the note that hadn't been there before tonight. "Find it," he exhaled sharply. "I think we just did." Claire stared at him, her eyes wide with realization. "Do you think?" Before she could finish, the garage light flickered. Just once. Just long enough for them to see the faintest shimmer of movement, the outline of a figure, a man, standing in the farthest corner of the garage. Dylan's breath caught. Not threatening, not angry, just watching. Then the light steadied. The figure was gone. But the message had been received. Chad's car was out there, and it was waiting to come home. Dylan stood frozen, heart pounding, staring at the empty corner where the figure had been. The air still crackled with an unseen presence, something lingering just beyond the edge of reality. Claire reached for his hand, her fingers trembling. "If the car is still out there," she hesitated, licking her lips. "We have to find it, don't we?" Dylan let out a breath, steadying himself. "Yeah, but where?" His gaze dropped back to the note. "Find it." Then to the model Mustang, the tiny number 68 scratched into its base. Clue left for them. Slowly, he turned the car over in his palm, inspecting every inch of it. His thumb traced the undercarriage again, and this time, he noticed something else. Something smaller. Letters, barely visible beneath the scratch marks. NFS. Dylan's stomach clenched. Claire saw it too. NFS, like, not for sale? Or Dylan hesitated. Need for speed. her brow furrowed. The game. Dylan shook his head, already grabbing his laptop from the workbench. No, the underground racing circuit. Chad wasn't just an actor, he was a racer. Street racer. And if his car's out there, and it hasn't been scrapped or stored away, he trailed off as he typed, searching through forums, social media, anywhere car enthusiasts might share information. Claire hovered beside him, her pulse racing. Then it's still on the streets. A beat of silence. Then a hit. Dylan's eyes widened. Holy shit. Claire leaned in. On the screen, a grainy photo, snapped at night, headlights cutting through darkness. A car speeding down a deserted highway. A 1968 Mustang fastback. Midnight blue. Restored. Pristine. Tagged just an hour ago. Dylan's hands clenched into fists. It's here, he whispered. In this city. Claire exhaled shakily. Then we find it. Dylan met her gaze. There was no turning back now. And outside, in the desert night, the wind howled again, low and distant, carrying the scent of gasoline and something older. Something watching. Something waiting. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.